And that brings me now to an introduction of, again, someone who doesn't need much introduction to this crowd. If there had to be a perfect speaker that can tell it like it is right now to this crowd, it's Tom Davis. As most of you know, probably most everybody in this crowd has had a chance to meet Tom Davis, whether it was in his career as a contractor before he went to Congress, his career as chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, where he in many ways led Fairfax County's pro-business development policies, where he served 7 terms in the House, and particularly on issues related to government contracting, particularly issues related to the D.C. government, where he was a leader not only on those specific issues, but on issues of finding common ground across the political divide, or maybe in his current role as Director of Federal Government Affairs for Deloitte & Touche. He has been somebody that I've known for close to 20 years that I've been involved in politics, and I got to say, when I had the chance to be governor, there was no better partner. And when it came to issues like taking on the challenge of trying to make the case to all of you, which we didn't make the case, I guess, too well, that maybe we ought to go ahead and raise some money for transportation here locally. We still both got the scars from the referendum back in 2002, but Tom Davis didn't need to step forward on that issue. He did because he thought it was important for the infrastructure of our community up here, whether it was his willingness to step forward in 2004 when we tried to, in a bipartisan way, to get our Virginia budget right that left Virginia, when I was at least able to turn over the keys, with $1 billion surplus, recognition as best managed state in the country, and that AAA bond rating. We wouldn't have made that tax reform policies in 2004 if there hadn't been people like Tom Davis and candidly his wife Jean Marie Devilites who were willing to kind of put Virginia first. And so as an ally, as a friend, as somebody who gets it about contracting and gets it about what it needs to get our government and our country back on the right path, please help me in welcoming our good friend, former Congressman Tom Davis.
Mark, thank you. Mark, thank you. The most impressive part of my resume he left out, and that is that I retired from Congress undefeated and unindicted, and I'm always very, very proud of that. It's a pleasure to be here with Mark because we've always had a great professional relationship. We recognize that when the elections are over, it's time for political leaders to act like adults and not continue the campaign. It's why he had a successful governorship, and I know he's as frustrated as we all are with the polarization in Washington today. This is really a polarized town right now. I mean, I haven't missed being out of Congress at all during this last 2 years when you look at what's going on. I mean, you get the Republicans and the Democrats. Some days you have the Republicans and the Republicans like this, but you have the Republicans and Democrats going hard at each other, the House and the Senate going hard at each other, the executive branch and the legislative branch going hard at each other. I'm telling you, there's only one thing, as you know, that brings this town together, and that, of course, is the Washington Redskins. The Redskins, for a few weeks each fall. To illustrate this, a couple of years ago, I was still in Congress. For the opening game, I went out to the Redskin Park to the opening game. I was still in Congress, so I had to buy my own ticket. And so, it was way up in the bleacher seats. But I noticed there was an empty seat down on the 50-yard line, right close. And it was empty at the start of the game. It was empty at the end of the first quarter. It was empty at the end of the second quarter. So at halftime, I walked down about 8 tiers to where the seat was, and it was still empty. It was next to an elderly lady, and I tapped her on the shoulder. I said, "Ma'am, is this seat taken?" She said, "Well, as a matter of fact, it's not." I said, "Would you mind if I sat here for the second half?" I said, "I can barely see the field with my binoculars up where I'm sitting." And she said, "Please, be my guest." I said, "I can't believe there's an empty seat here for the opening game. These things were scalping for hundreds of dollars out front." She said, "Well, I want you to know that was my husband's ticket." She said, "We'd been to 30 straight Redskin openers together, but he died." He said, "But I know he would have wanted me to be here today." And I said, "Ma'am, I am so sorry." I said, "But couldn't you have found a friend or a relative or somebody that could have used the other ticket?" She said, "No." She said, "They're all at the funeral." So that's the kind of loyalty. But But that's the kind of bond Mark and I have had through the years, and political adults do, where they kind of put the country and the state first. And so I really appreciate bringing this conference together. I think for a lot of you that are small businesses, for the first time, this will be very helpful in terms of networking. For some of you more experienced, it'll give you an opportunity to interact with the panels. I'm going to just share a few perspectives with you on government contracting. I was chairman of the House Reform and Oversight Committee, which has jurisdiction on contracting, and wrote a fair amount of law in the House on contracting. And before that was general counsel at two companies, PRC and AdTech, that were government contractors. And I guess the best way to illustrate it is, you know, when I retired from Congress, I started to make a little bit of money, and so we put an addition on the house. You have to have somewhere to put all your plaques and pictures from your days in, and nobody else was interested in looking at them but me, so I had to put an addition on the house. And so to put the addition on the house, I didn't have to issue an RFQ, or I didn't have to issue an RFP and get responses to that. I didn't have to publish anything in the Federal Register or anywhere else. Bids didn't have to be competitive. Didn't even have to have competitive bidding. I didn't have any Buy America provisions in what I was buying. I could just go out and do it. And at the end of it, when it was completed, there were no bid protests. The contractor got paid on time. It came in on budget, on time. We didn't have any auditors coming in afterwards to take money out of the hands of the contractor. Everybody was happy. And my wife, who oversees the project, I said I gave her an unlimited budget, and she exceeded it. But the fact is, it went pretty smooth. Of course, federal procurement doesn't work quite that way. It's not quite that fast. It's not quite that efficient, as Mark noted. But it's great work for those of you that are in the business. So you got a good paying customer that's not going anywhere. Banks love it when you have a contracting backlog if you're trying to lend some money. It's a very, very good customer. It's a great place to do business. And at this place in the economy, after the funds coming through stimulus and everything, it's basically you go hunting where the ducks are. There has been a lot of contracting activity because of the stimulus package in the region as well. Mark talked about government should have as its goal in contracting taxpayer value, and that really ought to be what drives government contracting. I know when I put the addition on my house, I wanted to get the best deal. I wasn't interested in setting something aside for this group or that group, or buying America, or having to buy certain products in a restricted area, or distributing who got it. I just wanted the best deal, and that is what ought to guide federal spending, that we take your dollars out of your paycheck, and we then will purchase services for that. And you want the best service. It don't care where it comes from. But unfortunately, government tries to fulfill a lot of other policy goals through its contracting procedures, so it makes it a little bit burdensome sometimes. So we have a lot of set-asides. Mark mentioned some of them, and you get a lot of innovation from some of the set-asides. Minority contractors, small businesses, veterans, disabled veterans, and the like. You have earmarks that come out of Congress, some good, some bad. We can have a long discussion about that, but sometimes the location, even the contractors are named through Congress. It's not always the most efficient way to get things. You have, as I said, Buying America certifications. Is it appropriate for us to spend a little extra to buy something made in America, or is it better to get the best product we can at the best price? These are ongoing debates in Congress. We don't do much firm fixed price at the federal level because we don't always, particularly in the IT area, because we don't always know what we want. We don't know what the requirements are going to be in advance sometimes. And so we become flexible, and we have other contracting vehicles. And the result is government contracting is not like putting an addition on your house. But government contracting, in my 30 years in the business, you find out that it has its own rules. It's not a corrupt system. It's a pretty open, transparent system. The rules are fairly consistent once they're understood. They're fairly predictable once you get into it and understand it. Doing a good job in your contract generally will set you up for getting more work, and doing a bad job will generally put you behind the 8 ball and make it harder the next time. As I said before, some of our best innovations, particularly in the technology area, when you look at Homeland Security and Defense, are coming from our small businesses. People with new, bright ideas. They don't have to go through the bureaucracies that some of the larger companies have. And so we've maintained, on a consistent policy, some set-asides for small business, recognizing that many will grow into large businesses, recognizing that a lot of jobs are generated, but also that a lot of innovation historically has come from small business. The biggest problem comes when you graduate from being a small business. The only other category you have is your large business. And where do you go for contracts once you lose that set-aside base? All of a sudden you're in against Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, and you're either a small business or a large business. One of the innovations we tried to bring in is in some of these large-scale GWACs in the government to have middle-sized businesses as well, because they keep getting acquired, but to try to reserve some component for businesses that weren't really large, but they were graduated from small business, and give some recognition to them. They're not in the code, but you'll see them sometimes in procurement authorities and in different schedules and GWACs. There's a recognition now where these middle-sized businesses, ones that have grown and shown some strength, but are not quite large, that they deserve a place there in the competitive sphere as well. How many of you out here are small businesses today? So the bulk, all right. How many of you have never done business with the government before but would like to? We got a handful. Well, this is a good place to be. How many of you, well, I'll stop with that. That gives me a good flavor for what we're through. For the first timers, let me just make a couple words. Try to get on a schedule. GSA schedules are the easiest. It's not that hard or that burdensome. You'll have small business reps today. You can walk about it. But when you go to sell for the government, it's great to have some contracting vehicle out there and ready. I don't even know all the schedules anymore. I know the 70 group schedule's the one I worked with the most. We even apply that group now for state and local governments have adopted it in some cases, and if you get on that schedule, it enables you to sell to different levels of government. We did that to get a congruity of products in some of these technology areas. But talk today, ask about getting on a schedule. If, in addition to that, if you're a small business or an 8A, look for partners. Network around. Look for some of the larger companies, maybe mentors, people that you can continue to meet with, learn from, and partner with. There may be small business set-asides where you have a component of what the government wants, and you find a large business, as long as they're doing 49% or less, you can qualify and bid that in and sometimes use their expertise and learn from that. In fact, that's what the small business and 8A programs are about, is basically mentoring and letting some of these small businesses grow. And so you want to use this opportunity today to network with other companies, network with some of the government agencies as well. Also, if you're first time or you're small, you have to get in and see the customers. One of the things I always like to do when my first company was a company called AdTech, we grew pretty substantially, but we would always get in and try to see the customers. And yeah, part of it is you want to let them know who you are and what your capabilities are, but we'd come out of these meetings a little smarter each time, finding out what did the customer want? Where did we need to be? You remember Wayne Gretzky? They called him the Great One in hockey. Somebody said, Wayne, how come you're so much better than all these other hockey players? And he said, well, most skaters skate to where the puck is. He said, I skate to where the puck is going to be. Well, in government contracting, you want to skate to where the needs are going to be in the future. You want to position yourself. And the only way you're going to find out, you can read all the periodicals you want, you can subscribe to all the reports you want, but to get in and talk to your CIOs and your deputy CIOs and the people in the government, find out what are their needs, what keeps them awake at night, what are they looking for solutions, these kinds of things. That can help you position yourself to where that puck is going to be. We used to have a saying, if you read about a procurement when it hits the street, when it's published, you're probably too late. There are probably several companies that have been tracking this, that understand it, that have been positioning themselves, maybe getting key personnel in order, their partnerships in order, so that they can compete for this. So it is important always networking, networking, networking. And for as a small business, that's the most important thing you can do. You'll have a lot of wasted network opportunity. You'll sit down by somebody lunch and you get nothing out of it. But, you know, occasionally you'll get a gem out of that, or you get something where you can work together again, or they'll call you because they recognize the expertise you have, or there's a small business vehicle, the large business you talk to says, well, maybe we can use these guys to front for us, but maybe we can use them. So these are the kinds of things and opportunities like today where you want to meet people, you want to talk, you want to follow up, and to the government agencies, talk to the people today, but find out who in their departments are doing what, and then follow up, call up, and go in and see them. That's the best thing you can do. You want to skate to where that puck is going to be, and use opportunities like today. What a great opportunity that Senator Warner has put together today for you, to learn firsthand from people on the panels, to go afterwards and talk, and then the follow-up work. And then you can kind of hone your skill level to what the government wants and try to bring that into some kind of congruity. In summary, for those of you that are first starting out or very small businesses, get on a schedule, find some vehicles out there, look for partners, look for mentors, and network, network, network. One other thing we found helpful is some of these very small companies put together small advisory boards where you get some people in business and you come in and you buy them a dinner once in a while and sit them on there and ask them for guidance. People, you know, gray hairs like me, we love to sit on these and just talk and give you some advice for young companies. It's kind of exciting to see what their business plans are, help them grow, and learn from the mistakes that you've made. I like to do that in politics. I like to do that in business. We're kind of old war horses at this point, and you like to share the knowledge, and there's no point you have to go through some of the pain we had to go through if you can sit and learn from us. So these are just a few suggestions for those of you that are very small and just starting out. Now, for those of you who are more experienced, let me try to shed some light on where I see the administration going on some of these areas and try to demystify some of the things you're reading about in the press. And I'm going to start with my favorite bugaboo, and that is the congressional budget and the appropriation bills, where every year we seem to run into these continuing resolutions. I can just tell you, that's not Mark Warner's fault. It's not any single person's fault. It's kind of the system. But as you know, the fiscal year ends October 1st, and if that appropriation bill for the year is not passed, and you have some follow-on work on a contract, many times you're not going to get that filled until they get their budget for the year. If you have won a contract, sometimes at the end of the year, I know at Deloitte, one of the things we like to do is at the end of the year when the agencies have money to spend, we're all over there trying to look to help them spend it. But if you have something coming up after the first of the year, the fiscal year, middle October, November, and that budget isn't, that appropriation isn't passed, it can be a real problem. You may have follow-on years where it's not being executed in time, contracts that are kind of put off. And that is just part of the congressional play-by-play. House generally passes their appropriation bills on time. The Senate usually not quite on time, but they have to still meet House and Senate together and reach deals. And in election years, it gets even tougher. I wouldn't be surprised to see this stuff go into November, December before you get a budget in some of the agencies. In fairness, they try to get Homeland Security out early. They try to get the defense bill, which is half of your discretionary spending, out early enough, and that covers a lot of people. But this is just something that has recurred for well before I was in Congress, and I'm afraid it's going to go on later, that we're going to be running up every year into continuing resolutions. And as business people doing business with the government, you need to learn how at the end of that fiscal year, a lot of money can go out the door that isn't spent yet. It's a great time to try to find new vehicles, and if you have something coming in after that, it may get slowed down. Understanding that process, not anybody's fault particularly, it's just part of the give and take you have of government and the way these things work. And this year, I think, is another year where in some of these appropriations bills, you're going to see large continuing resolutions and probably an omnibus passing. We'll see. If the Republicans take one house of Congress and they don't have it, they may push the whole thing into the next year. We learned as government contractors to try to go with that ebb and flow. It is a problem, but understanding that at the end of that year, a lot of money goes out the door right before, you know, in the September time frame. It's a great time to be walking the halls, finding contracting officers if you have the right vehicles. And then after October 1st, it can slow down pretty quickly. Senator Warner talked a little bit about insourcing. some of the things that we've been seeing in government. And let me tell you what is driving a lot of that. He talked about the budgetary problems that we've had for a long time in this country. We actually balanced the budget for 4 years in the late 90s, where we had a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, and they came together with a Balanced Budget Act. We had the dot-com bubble coming up, so a lot of tax revenues were generated, and then after 9/11, it was like a hole, and we've never recovered. The deficits have been up, 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 up. This year, I think for every dollar that was spent in the government spent, 41 cents was borrowed. And the hardest part for those in government is the fact that as baby boomers retire and become eligible for Medicare and for Social Security, the two largest and fastest growing programs in government, that sets demands for more budget at the expense of other areas. And then Medicaid is the third leading expenditure in government. So you take 4 items: interest on the debt, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. It's close to 2/3 of the budget is in these areas, and most of that money goes to retirees, to seniors. Even, I think in Virginia, 80% of Medicaid is for hospital beds, most of that for seniors. So the government's investments are basically on retirees, not in building for the future, in education, in R&D, in infrastructure. It is a formula that I think leaders of both parties understand is unsustainable. But I think the first manifestations we're seeing of government reacting to this is to shut down the discretionary spending on contracting and the like. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The move toward insourcing in government. Senator Warner talked about the money they were talking about bringing in-house. That's driven by political considerations, but it's also driven by some very practical considerations, and that is there is a lot of staff augmentation right now. We call it butts and seats, where the government's just going out and buying people. And you get to these. I went to a conference the other day where everybody there was a contractor. There wasn't a federal employee in the room. The person running the program was a contractor, and you had a contractor and many different contractors reporting through them. And I think from a federal point of view, that becomes unsustainable. They're trying to bring a little more of this in-house. There are pressures on a number of agencies to hire people that are currently federal employees and offer them jobs in federal positions. I don't know how many of you have seen this. The further you go from Washington, we see this at Wright Pat in Dayton, Ohio, and outside of Washington, I think it's probably stronger than it is here. But there is some pressure to bring some of this work in-house now and see what we can do. This isn't contrary to what we've seen in the last 2 administrations, where jobs were going out the door and were going to contractors. And the companies that are the greatest at risk at this point are those that are doing staff augmentation, where the government is now taking some of those folks, offering them jobs to bring them back into government so they can get your line control over this. What we have done, I mean, just one suggestion is if you feel as a contractor you have people at risk, I'd go talk to the contracting officers ahead of time. If they have a number to meet, try to help them get to that number without taking your people or with minimal damage. We tried to stay at Deloitte, we've tried to stay ahead of that curve, recognizing that we see it coming. There's going to be some attrition in these areas, but let's give it some definition and sit down with the people that we're reporting to and see how we can help them make their number in a way that doesn't impact our bottom line, but at the same time allows them to accomplish their mission. There's nothing wrong in this business of being proactive into some of these areas. So a lot of this is being aimed at the companies that are by and large body shops, as we call them, staff augmentation, butts and seats. And it's driven by the fact that you have contractors reporting to contractors, and the federal employees are just not in the loop in terms of command and control the way that some of the leadership would like to see it. We see this more pronounced probably in the Department of Defense than some other areas. Secondly, we have seen some OMB edicts come out just in the last couple weeks about some of these larger financial services reorganizations, ERPs. All of a sudden, they're being stopped. Follow-on work is being halted, and they are taking a look at some of these, and some of these programs are going to be canceled. And for those of you that are doing that work, that had counted on that, what does that mean to you? Well, let me tell you how this came about. Office of Management and Budget had a meeting where they called a lot of the leading companies and CEOs in for a day to talk about how do you do large-scale modernization projects. Because the government has had problem with a lot of these projects not coming in on time, not coming in on budget, and some of them 2/3 of the way through have just been scrapped. And that's taxpayer dollars that have gone for a program and the government's really gotten little or no value out of them. So there were some lengthy discussions, and one of the questions posed to the private sector was, well, how do you do these large-scale modernization projects? And what the government heard from the private sector was surprising. It was, well, we don't do them large scale. We do them in chewable bites. We do them in smaller increments. That's the way that we get our value. That we found out that doing large-scale projects doesn't work for us. The federal government says, geez, maybe we ought to try that. And so I think you're going to see a movement within government now to do this in chewable bites. And the rationale is simply this. And many times, you'll come in with a large modernization project where the government really needs a Piper Cub to fly from here to here, but the contractors come in and design an F-14 fighter jet. The employees are saying, why don't you just patch what I have? I don't need some brand new program with bells and whistles that I don't know how to use. I kind of liken it to my BlackBerry, which has all kinds of things I never use. I just learned after a year that I can get the Nationals games on here and get a stream feed from that, which I think is very useful during working hours. But it's but this has iTunes. It has stuff on here I would never use. I don't need it for work, and yet you pay for that. Well, when the government's designing a new program, they were getting all kinds of bells and whistles that as a practical matter they weren't using. So what you're going to see now is moving this in smaller bits and pieces, in chewable bites. And as they stop these programs and take a look at them, I see government saying, let's do some things in achievable, they call it chunking, where we can chunk this and get a piece of it done and then move on to the next phase. And so it's not an anti-contractor. In fact, on Monday morning I had breakfast with Vivek Kundra, who's the CIO over at the Office of Management and Budget. He said, what you need to understand is we expect to spend more in the IT field. Government spent $80 billion this year. We expect to spend like $87 billion in subsequent years. It'll just be spent differently. And we want to make sure we're getting our value. Because if you really want to shrink government, it means you're going to have to spend more onto IT and more onto systems that make us more efficient. But when we invest in these systems, we need to make it work. So that's the direction the administration going, and it's getting a lot of criticism in the contractor community. When you sit down, it kind of makes sense if they're being successful at this. So when you read about this, at the end of the day, I think there'll be more work for contractors, not less. Government by itself is generally not an innovator. We have basically outsourced most of our innovation to government contractors around. I think that necessarily continues. But it will be done in different ways. And it is the companies and the leaders that understand where they are going and are skating to where that puck is going than those that are just sitting back complaining they're going to be able to take advantage of this. Repeat, there will be more dollars out there, particularly in the IT field, than you have today, even with these cuts, because if you want to bring efficiencies in government, you do it through information technology. It'll just be done differently. It'll be done in chewable bites. It'll be done what we call in chunks, as opposed to a huge large-scale project somebody gets and it gets in over their head. So those are kind of, I just wanted to throw those out at the beginning of this conference. I think the panels will have some interesting discussions in terms of what they're doing in individual agencies. In conclusion, let me just say, for small businesses, I always try at a small business to walk in, and when I talk to the government, I would talk about we're a company, we're not a contract fulfillment company, we're a customer satisfaction. We're going to make this work because we have to work harder than the next guys. We need to earn your trust. Government procurement officers a lot of times will say, I'm going to give this to, I don't mean to pick on Lockheed Martin, they're a great partner of ours, or Northrop Grumman, but I'm going to give this to one of these companies because if it goes wrong, they say, well, don't blame me, I gave it to Lockheed Martin. And they're sometimes afraid to take that risk with a smaller company. So they go with the known commodity, with the known name. It makes it a little harder sometimes as small, innovative businesses for us to get their trust. But the one thing they do know, and they do find, is that they give it to a small business sometimes, that's going to be determined these businesses will deliver because their whole future is wrapped up in this contract. And they're not about saying, well, this wasn't in the contract, I need to change it. They are about, if you will, customer satisfaction. Satisfying the customer, not worrying, willing to take a little write-off here or there to make sure that they establish that reputation and can move on. Secondly, for you small businesses, network, network, network. get into the agencies, ask questions, network across with other companies, network with some of the trade associations, and network within with some of your peers as well. Find out what are the needs of government, where are they going with some of these issues. I want to thank Senator Warner for putting this together. I think this is a tremendous idea. He has been a great help, I think for the contracting community to have a voice on the Hill at a time when a lot of times policies that are coming out of Congress and out of the administration appear to be kind of anti-contractor. He's been great at being able to be that liaison, to translate it, to be an advocate in some of these areas. When he asked me would I come by and share a few thoughts today, I was very eager to do this. I think for those of us in the contracting community, he's been a great friend. I also want to just say that I like to end up with a story. I'm very proud of the technology community here in Northern Virginia. Like Senator Warner, I came out of the contracting community here in Northern Virginia and our technology community. When I was chairman of the county board, we did a lot of land use issues, started to lay the groundwork for a lot of these companies coming here and growing and prospering. But we've also always had this kind of love-hate relationship with the Silicon Valley. They kind of think they're the tech center of the world. They don't do much in government contracts. They have this kind of aloof, they're a little bit snobby, quite frankly, when it comes to thinking they understand technology. So as the chairman of the House Government Committee, one year I went out to the Silicon Valley to do a little tour to find out why these guys think they were so much better. And I found out just as federal spending drives our contracting, our federal spending through the Pentagon and through agencies and through DARPA, through NIH, the National Science Foundation, it is federal spending out there that drives their innovation as much as they may not want to meet it. There are 4 labs right in the Bay Area: Livermore, Sandia, Berkeley, and Stanford. And so I went out to lunch with Dr. Burt Richter. He is the dean of the Stanford University Laboratories. He's a Nobel Prize winner. By the way, George Mason's had 2 Nobel Prize winners, which we're very proud of here. But he was a Nobel Prize winner, and he told me about one of his colleagues at Stanford who won the Nobel Prize and found immediately upon winning the Nobel Prize that he could make more money going out around the country giving speeches and lectures than he could teaching or writing. And he had one of these hot topics where he could go out and he could get $5,000, $10,000, $10,000, sometimes as much as $25,000 for one speech. And his topic was in such demand, he was so hot after winning the Nobel Prize, that sometimes he could give 3 speeches in a day. He could give a breakfast speech, a lunch speech, an evening speech, and people would pay these top dollars, and the money is just pouring in. Well, this guy has been in the academy all his life. He never really cared about money. He cared about his books and his experiments and his laboratories, and he was really into his work. But the money's pouring in, and there are only so many liberal causes he could give it away to. So he starts figuring, he said, I'm going to travel first class. So he bought one of these high-tech limousines. I mean, this thing had everything. It had the global positioning system. Everything was digital. Hired a full-time, it had a wet bar. He had a chauffeur that drove him, picked him up in the morning, and would take him to his speech, and pick him up, take him to the next speech, and so on. I mean, it became a routine. Well, one day, they're between speeches, they're driving, and the chauffeur turns back. He said, Professor, this isn't fair. The professor says, what do you mean? He said, you make more money sometimes in 2 days than I make in an entire year. He said, and yet I'm the guy working most of the day. I have to drive you through rain, snow, sleet, icy roads. I've never gotten you there a minute late. He said, but the worst thing is, he said, I have had to listen to every one of your speeches, which is the same speech everywhere he goes. And he said, in fact, he said, I've heard your speech so many times. He says, I can give it better than you can. Well, this kind of upset the Nobel laureate. He says, all right, hotshot. He said, you think it's that easy? He said, let me tell you something. He said, in this next town, he said, they don't have the slightest idea what I look like. All they get is my curricula vitae. He said, we're the same age. He said, let's trade uniforms. I'll drive you in, you give the speech. If you screw it up, I'm going to give the money back and we'll make it right. But he said, if you pull it off, I'll split the fee with you. He said, you're on. So they get out town, they switch uniforms, and Nobel laureate drives in. They get to the auditorium. It's as large as this. People have paid top dollar to hear this Nobel laureate talk about his treatises and how he won the Nobel Prize. They have a greeting committee, greets the chauffeur as he comes out, dressed like the Nobel laureate. They usher him into the green room. They make some small talk. They give him this introduction on stage, and the chauffeur comes out and he proceeds to give the speech. Meantime, in the back of the room, the Nobel laureate, dressed as the chauffeur, sits back there. He has a Diet Coke, and he's kind of waiting for showtime. Well, the chauffeur gives the speech perfectly. He gives it flawlessly, except for one thing. Since he has memorized the speech, his cadence is much faster than the professor's, and he finishes up about 10 minutes earlier than usual. Well, he gets a thunderous applause. The master of ceremonies walks across the stage, hands him his check, looks at his watch. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is entirely unexpected, but I see we have a few minutes for questions from the audience." First question. Professor. He said, "I noticed in one of your earlier treatises where you discussed the effects of photosynthesis and sunspots and their effects on avic migration in southern New Zealand." He said, "Now, recent scientific periodical publications completely debunk this theory. And I wonder if you could explain to us in some detail this dichotomy." Man, chauffeur's looking around. Finally, he looked straight at the question. He said, "You know," he said, "you ought to be embarrassed asking such a dumb, stupid question like that in this room full of learned people." He said, "It's embarrassing." He said, "That question is so easy." He said, "I'm going to let my chauffeur in the back of the room answer it." So anyway, again, my thanks to Senator Warner for putting this together, and have a great conference. Thank you.